You're watching Digital Photography One-on-One, where we answer your questions. Here's your host, Mark Wallace.
Hi, I'm Mark Wallace, and you're watching another episode of Digital Photography One-on-One. In episode 1, I showed you how the shutter works and how you can balance flash and ambient light. Well, since that episode was posted, I've had hundreds of emails from people asking me to do a better job of explaining the metering portion of that video. Well, that's what this episode is all about, learning how to use your light meter to determine the balance between your flash and ambient light. In this video, I'm going to be using the Sekonic L758, and the reason for that is Sekonic has this really neat feature that shows you the exact percentage of light that's coming from your flash. So this will work with a 758, or if you have an L358, the same thing will work. It's very common on both Sekonic light meters. The other thing I'm going to do a little bit differently in this video is instead of using a studio strobe, I'm going to be using an on-camera flash. I'll be using my Canon 580EX. Now I've asked Caroline to come join me and help me demonstrate this technique. We're going to be shooting in an office space that has really nice light coming from the side, and we're going to be using some fill flash to balance out that light. So let's get going. We're in this office and we have some really nice light coming in from the right side of the room. Now, although this light is really nice, we don't have any light coming from the opposite side of the room. And that means that if we take a shot of Caroline, the left side of her face is going to be a little bit dark. Now, for this episode, I'm going to assume that you know a little bit about basic exposure and the relationship between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. If these are new terms to you, then I highly recommend that you read the book Understanding Exposure by Brian Peterson. Okay, the first thing we need to do is set up our camera and our flash. For complete exposure control, we're going to set our camera to full manual mode, and at this point, just leave your flash turned off. Once that's set, we're going to take a basic ambient light reading. Now this will just help us understand, give us a starting point, and help us understand what kind of ambient light we have. If the ambient light is low, then we'll know that either a tripod or a higher ISO is going to be needed. Now I like to start out by metering at a 60th of a second to see if there's enough ambient light to support that shutter speed. And if there's not, well, I know I either have to increase my ISO or just be satisfied that there's not going to be as much ambient light in the scene as I would like. So let's give it a try. I'll set my meter to ambient mode, select shutter priority, and set my shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. My ISO is at 100. I'm using a lens with a maximum aperture value of 2.8. So if my meter reading is below 2.8, that means I can't shoot at ISO 100 and in a 60th of a second. Now ideally, I'd like to have my reading to be a 60th of a second and around f6. Now f6 is totally subjective. I just like that because it gives me a nice depth of field. So let's take a meter reading and see how these things all come together. All right, so let's take our first meter reading here. So I'm going to point this directly at the camera, take a reading, and this says 60th of a second at f3.2 at ISO 100. So really I want to have my aperture value to be a little bit smaller than that for my depth of field. So what I can do here is I can make adjustments in the meter to see how that impacts my exposure. So I'm going to push my ISO button, and I'm going to increase my ISO until I see around f6. So here we go. At ISO 400, my meter is saying, well, that would be a 6.3 aperture value, which is about what I want. So just to make sure, I'm going to take another meter reading here, and it's telling me, yep, 60th of a second at 6.3, and my ISO is 400. So let me set up my camera to these settings, and we'll take a test shot here to see exactly how that looks. We had a 60th of a second, our aperture value was 6.3, and our ISO was 400. Okay, now that that's set, remember, my flash is off, and we're just doing this to get a nice starting point to see what our ambient light looks like. So let me take a quick test shot, and we'll take a look and see how that looks. Okay, let's look right this way. Great, Caroline. Look right at me. Excellent. Okay, this image looks pretty good, but it's just a little bit dark on the right side of the image. So let's add a little bit of fill flash to sort of even things out. Now it's time to turn on your flash. For total exposure control, make sure that you have your flash set to manual mode. Now to start with, I'm going to set this flash to about 1/8 of its total power. And we can adjust that up or down as we start playing with the exposure. I'll show you that in a little bit. The other thing I'm going to do here is, instead of having my flash pointing straight forward, I don't want to blast Caroline, I'm going to raise this so it bounces off the ceiling and gives us a nice soft fill flash. Now that'll be much more flattering to Caroline and give us a much more realistic look to our exposure. Now it's time to take our combined flash and ambient light measurement. Now to do this, I'm going to set my Sekonic light meter to the auto reset cordless flash mode. Now I'm doing this because I'm using an on-camera flash and there's no way for me to use a sync cable to connect from my meter to my flash to trigger it. So what this allows me to do is I can press my measurement button. The meter waits up to 90 seconds for a flash to fire. Once the flash fires, it gives me the correct readout, then I can look at that, which is really cool if you don't have something to connect your flash to your meter. Okay, the other thing I want to do is to make sure that my meter is set to the same settings as my camera. So I know my shutter speed is at 1/60th of a second and my ISO is at 400. I've set that up, I have it on the right mode. Now I'm going to come back here and I have Caroline to press the measurement button. And then I'm going to trigger the flash. So if you could press that, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to press the test button here. Now that's fired. Now we have a reading. And the magic of this meter is that this will not only give us the correct meter reading, but it tells us exactly what the percentage of the flash is. So this is telling me that my meter reading is at 1/60th of a second at f8, and I have 40% of the light is coming from my flash. Now I would like to have 50% of the light coming from my flash, so all I need to do is just increase the power of my flash just a bit, and we'll have that nice even matched ratio. So let me do that. I'm going to come over here and change this from 1/8 of a power up to 1/4. I'm going to have Caroline again push this measurement button. Once she does that, I'll fire the flash. That's fired. And now we have exactly 50%. The Sekonic is telling us that we have a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, f10, and we have 50% of the light coming from our flash. So let me set my camera to those meter readings and we'll take a picture and take a look and see what it looks like. Caroline, perfect. Okay, now the really cool thing is that the meter will do all the calculations for us now. Once we have our initial reading, it'll calculate anything for us if we want to change the ratio of flash to ambient light. So right now we're at 50%, but let's say I wanted to go up to 60 or 80% flash. Well, all I need to do is use the jog wheel and change the shutter speed, and when I do that, as I go up in shutter speed, up in the upper right hand corner it's saying 60%, 70%, 80%. Now let's say we wanted to do the opposite. We wanted to have less fill light. So what I can do is I can take my shutter speed and roll it back. I'm going down. Now when I hit 20th, 15th of a second, my meter is telling me that now only 20% of the light is coming from the flash. So it does all of the balancing for you, and it will tell you exactly how much light is coming from your flash in each exposure. It's really, really cool. So let's try this. Let's try one at 20%, and I'll try another one at 80%, and we'll take a look at those. Well, that's about all there is to it. It really comes down to 3 basic steps. Step 1, take an ambient light reading and then adjust your camera accordingly. This will give you a great starting point. Step 2, turn on your flash and take a new meter reading. Then adjust the output of your flash up or down, metering along the way until you get the perfect balance between flash and ambient light. Step 3, use your Sekonic meter to automatically calculate shutter and aperture values for new ratios between flash and ambient light. The Sekonic meters make this super easy with the percentage output right here on the meter itself. Okay, well that's all we have time for in this episode. Remember, if you have a question you'd like us to answer, send it into studiolighting@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.
This episode is brought to you by snapfactory.com and studiolighting.net. For more information about our workshops, visit snapfactory.com.